Today we will hear a review of Songs of America, Patriotism, Protest, and the Music That Made a Nation by John Meacham and Tim McGraw. Quincy Jones says, "From the songs of the enslaved to the sounds of the civil rights movement, from the Star-Spangled Banner to Springsteen's The Rising after 9/11, John Meacham and Tim McGraw have convened a concert in Songs of America." Our presenter today is Michael Lasser, host of the nationally syndicated public radio program Fascinating Rhythm, and author of City Songs and American Life, 1900 through 1950. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lasser.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's good to be here. For those of you unfamiliar with it, this is the book. And Random House has spared no money. In fact, the book is only $30. Imagine saying that a book is only. It's a handsome book. As you can see, it's somewhere between a trade book and a coffee table book in format. It's larger than a trade book, but it's not the size of an art book. And inside, it's filled with illustrations, many of them in color, many of them printed very well. They did not spare expense. It's a fine gift, but is it equally fine history? And that depends. And that's where I guess I'm going. If you've seen Meacham as a talking head on TV, you know that he's highly intelligent, well-educated, and well-spoken. He occupies the role of public intellectual. We have a few in this country, not a lot, but a few. Well, we don't have we have intellectuals all over the place. We just call them academics. But we don't have a long and deep tradition of the public intellectual in this country. Emerson was perhaps our greatest public intellectual. And if you've never read Emerson, you really should. He was a great figure, and he could write. But as for Meacham, who does occupy this role, and I think occupies it well, unlike someone like the very impressive Michael Beschloss, for example, who's another one, Meacham does it with a sense of humor. He's also a very, very good writer. He's a splendid writer. His prose combines natural lyricism with the vitality of the best American speech. He's always readable, regardless of subject, and this book is certainly no exception. He borrows from Abraham Lincoln and the preamble to the Constitution to urge us to pursue the better angels of our nature so that we may build a more perfect union. And that is one of the themes, whether stated or implicit, that runs through this book. He understands what we've accomplished as well as the many ways in which we've fallen short and failed. Remember that the Declaration of Independence is not a guidebook to daily living. It's a goal. It's a dream. It's an ideal. It's a vision of what Reagan called the city on the hill. He perhaps claimed that we were there a little prematurely. But this sense of reaching in a variety of ways certainly runs through the book, as it runs through our history, as it runs through the mind of anybody who's read any American history and thought about the nature of this nation. And so he does face the ways in which we've fallen short, but he also believes in what we might become. He praises us for our vision, and in some of the ways we've embodied that vision over the years. But he also looks squarely at our flaws and our worst mistakes. This is not a conventional history. The Puritans play almost no role. His book is impressionistic, anecdotal, thematic. It's also highly selective. He leaves out a lot. He writes about the Declaration of Independence, but he doesn't pay much attention to the struggle to write it or ratify it. He pays rather little attention to the struggle to make the Constitution. He omits the Articles of Confederation entirely, but he does write about the 7 Years' War in which George Washington fought. I don't want to suggest to you that he's careless or clumsy, only that he knows what he's about, and he's not, thank God, writing a history textbook. W.H. Auden, the great poet, wrote in 1939 in a poem called September 1939, "Thou shalt not commit a social science." And the good news is that Meacham does not commit a social science. At this end of our history, he mentions Carter, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and Obama only in passing, and never mentions Donald Trump, although he does take a few indirect swipes at our current president. For what he includes and what he omits, Meacham has his own reasons. The book feels effortless. It feels as if he sat down and dashed it off. The bibliography at the back gives the lie to that assumption, but that's how it feels. He is so sure. The writing is so sure. It feels more like a series of related, interwoven essays rather than a series of chapters in a single book. And I think you know that good essayists who write well are treasures, even if nobody does read them. Shirley, do you have any idea how well this book is selling? That would be interesting. Yeah, how many people want to get their hands on it and read it? Yeah, I'd be curious. Wouldn't you be curious to know that? I would, yeah. And so it's less this happened, then that happened, then that happened, even though it's good and interesting history, and more, here's my take on what happened, and then here's my take on what happened. And did you ever think about the fact that these two things might be connected? And so it's less a book of history than a collection of articulate, well thought out thoughts about history. The book is chronological, but its logic is associative rather than linear. He'll discuss a large theme like civil rights as part of 2 or 3 different chapters. And so you will encounter it here, but he won't tell you the whole story. And then later on you'll encounter it again here because something else happened in civil rights that was important 30 years later and somehow relates to this and such. Did any of you watch Ken Burns' country music series? Did you notice how in the second half of it, where he's focusing somewhat more on individual songwriters and performers and less on the shape of the music, how it evolves? I've noticed that often in Burns's work. I think it's a weakness, frankly. I think the music is still evolving, and rather than just showing us Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, we need to know more about where they come from and what they achieve other than hits, and where he thinks they might take us. I think that's a problem in Burns's work, even though it's very good. But there ain't no perfection, and it's okay to be critical. But one of the things he does with people like Willie Nelson and Johnny Cash, and even Merle Haggard to some extent, but not as much, is raise the story of them and tell part of it, and then maybe an hour later or in another episode come back to them. In effect, he's letting them grow up. He's letting their music evolve. And it's very effective because, now he can't do it with Joe the singer, but he can do it with Waylon Jennings because everybody knows who Waylon Jennings is, even if you're not a country music fan, and so you'll follow along. And you'll pick up. You won't forget that he talked about Waylon Jennings on Tuesday, and now it's the following Sunday. We still can remember that long. And so it's a similar kind of structure in that way. Things show up where Meacham chooses to put them. And the associations he makes are sometimes predictable, sometimes a little surprising and more interesting for that. For example, he covers women's suffrage, civil rights, and World War I in the same chapter. Now, civil rights in that chapter is not Martin Luther King, it's W.E.B. Du Bois. That doesn't mean it's not civil rights. Just because we didn't live through it and remember it doesn't mean it wasn't. In another chapter, and this really was lovely, he moves quite deftly from Elvis Presley and Richard Nixon to Vietnam to feminism to gay rights to 9/11. And the photograph of Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley is worth the price of admission. You want it? Well, give me a minute. Let me see. Let me see. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it from the back, but you can come look at it after. I don't even know if I'm in the right chapter. Rochester figures because of Susan B. Let me go back here and look at the table of contents so that you all don't have to finish your lunch on the run. Some things you cannot make up. I can't believe that someone went, oh. I hesitate to ask who you are over. Is that extraordinary? Poor Nixon with that frozen smile on his face, wondering who the hell is this man? And why is he dressed so funny? Anyway, those kinds of weavings are always insightful, but also sometimes sketchy. I mean, he'll give you something in a sentence that could easily have taken a chunk of a chapter. And so he's making a series of decisions all along the way. You or I, at various points, might have made other decisions. I want to know more about that. Now, I can, obviously. There's a whole damn library out there. But in terms of the reading, gee, I wish he'd said more about that. There are moments of that kind of frustration. And yet, again and again, both explicitly and implicitly, he confirms his belief that the United States is the only nation based on an idea, what Jefferson called our unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He doesn't take on the controversies over Jefferson. They don't appear in the book. He doesn't take on the fashionable knocking of Jefferson that we have encountered. Was he a flawed man? Obviously. A flawed man is a redundancy. But did he do some pretty terrible things? Yeah, he did. But to make him less than the irascible John Adams, as David McCullough goes out of his way to do, I think is downright irrational. And then to whitewash Adams, which is another thing McCullough does. I think it borders on the irresponsible. I don't admire McCullough's book on John Adams. I admire some of McCullough's books enormously, but not that one. Meacham, though, is doing a different kind of book. He's got more leeway. He's got more elbow room. Because in addition to affirming the Jeffersonian affirmation, the Jeffersonian endowment, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. He takes an equally clear-eyed view of our failures, including slavery, women's suffrage, and sometimes immigration. However, those are not new ideas. Other historians have spoken to both the idea of America and the flaws of America. That's not new. Meacham, though, does it with a kind of glamour. That's not quite a fair word, but you understand. He writes so well. He's got such a large audience. He appears on TV where he talks about it. When he's on a program like Brian Williams late at night. So what makes the book distinctive? Well, first of all, it's bloody well written. It's very readable. But truly what makes it distinctive is Meacham's weave of songs into the American story. He ranges from Yankee Doodle Dandy to God Bless America, from the Battle Hymn of the Republic to Born in the USA, from the Star-Spangled Banner to We Shall Overcome. Music, he claims, and I agree, and gives us a way to gain a fuller understanding of what he calls our confounding nation. Isn't that a lovely phrase? Our confounding nation. Patriotism and protest are inextricably intertwined. And now I'm going to quote him. And are as vital to each other as wings to a bird. For the nation cannot soar without both. Isn't that good? There are relatively few songs in the first chapters. There were relatively few songs that were published in those years. They served their purpose in the book, certainly, even though you will never have heard of a good number of those early songs. They're long forgotten, including, for example, John Dickinson's once popular Song of Liberty, written in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. And I think if I asked you all to join me in singing it, none of us would be singing it, including me. But it was of its time. It was part of the protest linked to the Boston Tea Party. Great events, and the songs that Meacham is interested in mainly are songs that have to do with great events. Call forth men and women to set a response in song. Some of the songs are terrible. Cindy and Alan. Cindy, I work with two singers, Cindy Miller and Alan Jones, and we do a variety of programs around the country, and we're preparing one now on women's suffrage. And until the 20th century, most of the songs are pretty dreadful because most of the songs were written by women, obviously, because they had the most direct stake, but they weren't songwriters. They were women who were created to a cause, and their passion expressed itself, their conviction expressed itself in song. God bless them for it, because singing together works. Except they were terrible songs. They were terrible songs because they didn't know how to write songs. I mean, their motives were pure. You need more than good intentions. You need to know how to do it. But the songs were brief and direct and insistent, and they elevated through music to reach a position of conviction and sometimes authority. What more do you want from a song? America the Beautiful, for example. Lift Every Voice and Sing, for example. As the years pass, more songs appear, and so as the book progresses, Meacham gives more and more attention to songs. Bless him, he quotes them at length. They must have paid a fortune to get the licensing rights. And then eventually, songwriting becomes a business in which the songs are produced by professionals in New York, mainly, New Orleans, Hollywood, and eventually Nashville. And songwriting becomes a profession, at the very least, a craft. There are many more songs in this book that come from folk music than Tin Pan Alley, as you would expect. But God Bless America is a Tin Pan Alley song that ended up on Broadway. So there it is. That is the range. And Meacham covers the full range of popular music. By amateurs caught up in the passions of patriotism or protest, but also the pros, the professionals. The book interweaves every conceivable form of American popular music. Anthems, spirituals, jazz, hymns, pop tunes, folk, rock and roll, gospel, hip-hop, rap, and the blues. Did I leave anything out? If I did, I can assure you Meacham did not. He doesn't write about folk music per se. He chooses to write about Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and their songs, like We Shall Overcome, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, and so on. Something else makes this book distinctive. Country singer Tim McGraw is Meacham's neighbor and friend. Now, if you're a baseball fan, you will understand when I say that the McGraw who matters to me is Tug, his father. Tug McGraw was a great relief pitcher for those who don't follow baseball. And I can affirm that I learned most about heartbreak in this life from the New York Mets. I am a fan, and Tug McGraw was a great relief pitcher for the Mets. The book grew out of conversations between John and Tim. They decided they would like to do a book together. And if you notice, when I held it up, John McGraw's name comes first, but they get equal billing. McGraw really doesn't deserve equal billing. His contribution is a large number of sidebars. Do I need to tell you what a sidebar is? Good. About individual songs. He never takes on the large subjects. He writes about individual songs, an individual song, perhaps two, in a given sidebar. He's capable of an engaging turn of phrase, an occasional insight. Oh, I hadn't thought that about that song before. That's interesting. He has a voice of his own, and it's not Meacham light, it's his own. But mainly, he repeats what Meacham has already told us, rather more fully and certainly more elegantly. If I were reading the book on my own, if I were just reading the book rather than having been assigned to read the book, I might have skipped some of them. Well into the book, I might have started not bothering with them. There's nothing wrong with them. Not at all. There's not enough right with them, I think. Back to the book proper and Meacham. He believes that America, despite its flaws, is ultimately a force for good in the world. Have we done terrible things here and abroad? Yes. Are we ultimately, on balance, a force for good in the world? Have we been? He would say yes. He's no sentimentalist, but rather, I think he's the best kind of patriot. He looks America in the eye. I'd say that the more history you know, the easier it will be for you to follow Meacham's connections, although he certainly writes them out clearly. And even as you read, add more depth to them. But the more history you know, the less you will need this book, except as an entertainment. A graceful, sure-handed, knowledgeable entertainment rooted in conviction, but an entertainment nonetheless. There's nothing wrong with writing entertainingly. I vote for it. I don't know about you, but I vote for readable books. I would say that this is probably minor Meacham. This is not the biography of Andrew Jackson. This is minor Meacham. But it will provide a graceful, if occasionally bumpy ride, bumpy because he's telling us hard truths, through our imperfect union and our everlasting struggle to borrow from Ben Franklin's admonition to keep our republic. Thank you very much. Thank you.